Statins. Are they really as bad as they think you are, or are they even worse? Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, helping you take control of your health. And today I am joined by Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who is a professor of some sort at MIT. What is the specifics?
Senior research scientist.
Senior research scientist. I thought she's a senior research scientist at MIT, has a lot of background in computers, and I think she has the distinction of being interviewed. Maybe half the record number of people I've interviewed. Maybe Barbara Loe Fisher was more,
I think
but
so.
you're certainly up there. So this is good. And the reason we do that is because she's such a fountain of information. And today, as you know by the introduction, we're going to talk about statins. Specifically, we're going to be reviewing a book called The Dark Side of Statins, which has been published and out for a bit and was written by Dr. Graveline, who was a victim of statin side effects and actually died from complications from statins. So he is not able to join us for the interview, and we thought the perfect substitute would be Dr. Seneff, because her husband, and I'll let her tell the story in a moment, was severely affected by statins. And this was, my guess is, before she started really seriously exploring the benefits of natural medicine. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. Seneff, and I will let you take it from here because you are such an expert at telling the story.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. And you're right, my husband actually did me a big favor in terms of getting me into this whole space. He really changed my career by getting sick. So, I mean, it's not what you want your husband to do, but he was diagnosed with heart disease 10 years ago and put on a high-dose statin, 4 times the normal dosage. The doctor said, you have to take this for the rest of your life. If you don't, I will no longer be your doctor. And he started immediately suffering from all kinds of side effects, you know, all the muscle pain, the weakness, even the road rage, I mean, behavioral changes. And I just knew this drug wasn't working. And I started, you know, researching statins up one side and down the other. In fact, started doing it as part of my work at MIT. Started analyzing statin side effects and finding all kinds of horrible things. And he got off of them after a year. He slowly tapered it down. And I'm happy to say he's statin-free and doing great at this point, 10 years later, still statin-free. His doctors keep on reminding him, and he keeps on telling them no, politely.
Yeah, he knows
new doctor, you know, he fired the one that would no longer be his doctor, but he's got a new doctor who is not exactly on board, but he's willing,
So what was the justification they had for giving him a dose 400% the recommended dose?
Four times, yeah. I don't actually understand why they did that, because his cholesterol was not particularly high. So I think it's just because this particular doctor, it turned out he was one of, Victor found out later that, you know, there was information about Massachusetts and doctors getting funding to do working with the pharmaceutical companies, and his doctor was #1 in Massachusetts, the most funded by, you know, I think by Pfizer actually. So, and Lipitor was the product that he was taking. So I think it was totally,
yeah. Yeah, I think collectively, just so, I mean, this is one of the most commonly used medications and drugs in the world, statins as a class, but from a dollar perspective, I believe statins have sold over $10 billion.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers, but I know it's obscenely big.
Yeah, and a big portion of those sales were Lipitor.
Yes.
But they've been on the market for a long time, and you know, this was sort of an art, because I started practicing in 1985. I graduated med school in 82 and did a residency. And when I started practicing, high cholesterol was not really a thing in the 80s. It really, I mean, people, when I was sort of conned into conventional medicine and brainwashed and believed that high cholesterol was a problem at the time, and I would draw the person's blood, and I was a new kid on the block, and I tell them, hey, you have high cholesterol, and they would go back to their doctor and say, no, I don't, and they were just using the normal reference ranges. So, you know, it really didn't pick up until the late 80s, early 90s.
Yes, I mean, once they thought they had a really good argument, you know, they did some studies and they used this sort of relative risk with very rare risk. So when the population as a whole has an extremely low risk, and then you can get a large percentage change, but it's actually a very small difference for the actual individual in terms of the likelihood of it reducing your risk of your absolute risk. You know, they play that trick all the time.
Yeah, why don't you? That's a good point. So, why don't you expand on that? Because the difference between absolute and relative risk, because it's a really important sort of trick or magic trick that many of these companies use to confuse people into believing that the benefits of the medications are extraordinarily higher than they actually are.
Right. So what they do is they do a study in which the absolute risk is very rare. Let's say 2% of the population actually is expected to have whatever it is they're monitoring happen, like say a heart attack. And then so they look over a period of time and they find that the control group has the 2% with this occurring, and the treatment group has, let's say, 1.5% instead of 2%. So that's a 0.5% decreased risk from your standpoint. But from their standpoint, that's 25% improved performance because it's 0.5 out of 2, 1/4 of the relative risk has been taken away. Therefore, it's a 25% improvement, which sounds much better than 0.5%, 0.5%.
Yeah, it's like 50 times better.
Yes.
So, and those numbers are actually quite conservative because many times it's exploded beyond those numbers. So to just give outrageous, I mean, 100, 200%, 300%, when the actual reality is it's a very small actual decrease in the risk.
Yes, and of course, what I think is that you're decreasing your risk of heart attacks, but you're not necessarily decreasing your risk of heart disease because you're driving yourself towards heart failure because of the damage that the statins do to muscles, and the heart is a muscle. So you're trading off heart attack for heart failure, and I think a heart attack is preferred over heart failure. These are two different diseases of the heart.
Well, what you've just stated suggests that you believe that the statins actually decrease the risk of heart attack. Is that fair to say?
I think they do decrease the risk of heart attack. They don't necessarily decrease the risk of the big heart attack. I think they actually do, like with the forest fires, if you're very careful to always put out the forest fires, and then the trees get really dry, and then finally you get, something just explodes and you get this giant forest fire that you never saw before because for many years you kept them away. It's sort of like that you keep away the small heart attacks that don't really matter. And then the pressure sort of builds up, and so you get one of these bigger heart attacks that's more likely to kill you. So they don't necessarily even improve heart disease risk, heart attack risk. I mean, how do I say this? Death from heart attack. They decrease the frequency of heart attacks.
That's the ultimate barometer is death, not heart attack, death. So that's what we're looking for. Does it help decrease the death rate from heart disease? And it doesn't for three primary reasons. One is that it lowers your cholesterol, and I'll let you expand on this and I'll just give the summary, but it lowers your cholesterol. Cholesterol is an important precursor for many of our steroid hormones, actually most of them. And it also lowers coenzyme Q10.
Yes, that's crucial. And Doc talked a lot about that in his book.
Yes, and what he didn't talk about, and I don't think he knew of it, it actually lowers two other things, vitamin K2, and it also lowers, it's the same darn enzyme. See, almost all the statins inhibit this enzyme called HMG coenzyme A reductase. And that's the enzyme that your liver uses to make ketones. So if you're on a statin drug, you can't make ketones effectively. You'll never increase your ketone. You can go fast all you want. You're not going to be making them.
That is remarkable. And he did not pick up on that. I'm pretty sure because I read the book carefully.
No, he didn't mention it. I don't think he knew of that. But he did mention the last one, which I wasn't aware of. And perhaps you can expand on everything I mentioned. Not just throwing it out for you so you can take the discussion. But this, and I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's Dolichol.
Yes, I was hoping you would bring that up because I was very fascinated by that part, and I didn't know it either. I had come across it actually from his webpage. I'd come across mentions of Dolichol, and it kind of went over my head, and I didn't really pay attention. You know how it is. Yeah. And his book goes into the Dolichol very, very nicely, and it inspired me to even go back and look for some papers because Dolichol is very interesting.
Yeah, it's more. He believes it's just as important as CoQ10. So why don't you enlighten us on your perspective on that? Because you've done the research. That you're such a diligent researcher. I mean, you just go to the literature and digest it. I mean, it's just.
I love that part.
Decades of I know, and how many people do? You're so good. And what I forgot in our introduction too, you've written a book. I think was that your first book? Yeah, and you were. yeah, we were kind enough to ask me to write the foreword to it, which I
Yes,
did, and it was a very interesting book. And really, truthfully, it's a fiction book,
yes,
but it's really sort of autobiographical, and really the primary character in the book is you, and
yes.
it really it sort of emulates your journey in this pattern. It's a fascinating book, and I forgot the name of it though.
Yeah, Cindy and Erica's obsession to solve
That's what.
the healthcare crisis in America, and then there's a big thing, which diseases. It's like
Yeah.
autism and Alzheimer's and all these things. So, and I went into statin drugs and vaccines and glyphosate, the weed killer, all of that. And I was discovering it in real time as I was putting it into the book. So it was very much of a personal, it was even written in real time over the course of a year and a half. So
Yes. Yeah, you could tell that. It was really a fascinating read. I'm glad I got a chance to read it. But anyway, that's a diversion. I just wanted to go back to that because I forgot to put it in the
yes.
intro. But
So
why don't you
the
expand on the Dolokal, the CoQ10?
I know, gosh. And of course, we
and all
talk
those.
a lot about the mitochondria because the mitochondria are super, super
Absolutely.
important.
And Dolokal is important in mitochondrial function too.
Absolutely. Dolokal does a lot of things. It's very, it's amazing actually how many things it does. And one of the things I really picked up on in reading this book was that it is responsible for the process of putting the sugar chains on top of proteins that are glycosylated proteins. And this is super, super important because there's many really interesting proteins in the body that get these sugar chains added to these sort of, these so-called glycosaminoglycans, the extracellular matrix, all that stuff that I always talk about, and how important those things are to maintain the barrier function in the cell and to regulate the uptake of all the different nutrients. So the cell actually decorates itself with these. It puts these proteins into the membrane, attaches them into the membrane, like syndicans, for example. And then it attaches all these sugar chains to those proteins to build this barrier around the cell that influences the water around the cell to make it into gel. So it's the sulfated proteoglycans that I talk so much about that are put together and assembled on top of these proteins by Dolokal. It cannot happen without Dolokal, which is truly amazing to me. So it would mean, for example, that the muscle cells, which of course have lots and lots of mitochondria, require lots of energy, and the muscle cells get hit really hard by statin drugs. If they can't maintain that extracellular compartment in a healthy state, they're not going to be able to easily take up nutrients, for example, sugar. And, we end up with type 2 diabetes, and statins have been shown to cause type 2 diabetes, increased risk. And whether that's happening in part because those extracellular matrix proteins are not being properly assembled. So it can't easily get the sugar in.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation because the connection between statin use and diabetes is relatively recent within the past few years. We didn't know that for the longest time.
Yes, it's really come out now.
The mechanism has always eluded us, and
this could be part
when you
of it,
describe the process, it makes a lot of sense.
And it hasn't been said that that's why, but it might be why. And then of course Dolokal also fixes DNA mistakes. I mean, this is super huge. It's really interesting that when DNA is assembled, there lots and lots of mistakes are made, and they're constantly repaired. There's this whole repair process that a mistake is made. Whoops, we made a mistake. Do it again. Whoops, we made a mistake. Do it again.
Well,
over and over.
It's not even so much the mistakes, it's that we're exposed to oxidative stressors. I mean, some is good,
right.
but excessive oxidative stress, especially from EMF, can radically damage DNA.
Right. I mean, they get damaged by virtue. You can't have biological reactions without having sort of mistaken biological reactions. It's sort of like it's hard to control, so only the good things happen and the bad things don't. And so when the bad things happen, you have to either have a way to repair it, or you just have to throw away the whole thing, completely break it apart and build it again. So with DNA, there's a very good mechanism to repair it on the fly as you're assembling it. Otherwise, you'd never be able to get it right, And this mechanism depends on Dolokal.
And it's an extraordinarily effective mechanism. I mean, the amount of damage that is repaired every day. I mean, I believe it goes around if you were to take our DNA and put it end to end, all of our DNA in our cells, it would go around like the Earth like 40,000 times.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, biology just never ceases to amaze you. It's just like a mystical story all the time. There's so many parts about biology. So fascinating.
These repair mechanisms are almost going at the speed of light to repair all that damage.
It's incredible, and the fact that it actually produces a really very accurate copy of DNA in general. I mean, of course, when it makes these mistakes, you end up with cancer, so that's really bad. And the mitochondria in particular, they have DNA, so they're separate from the nucleus, and they have DNA inside them, the mitochondrial DNA. That DNA is much more exposed because the mitochondria have to use all the superoxide to do what they're going to do to make ATP. The DNA in the mitochondria is very susceptible to damage. And so it's a really big deal to make sure to protect it. And both the coenzyme Q10, coenzyme Q10 is a wonderful antioxidant that is in the mitochondria to help keep them from making those mistakes. And then the dolichol is in there to help them repair the mistakes when they're made. So both of them are going to be deficient on a statin drug, which is really asking for trouble with respect to the muscles in particular, because they have lots and lots of mitochondria.
Yeah, I think 85% of the DNA damage is in the mitochondria because that's where the energy is produced. But interestingly, most of the DNA there is only for the mitochondrial proteins, which are a relatively small number. Your biological DNA is really in the nucleus, and fortunately, there's nowhere near as much damage. But it's an interesting symbiosis that's developed between the mitochondria and our eukaryotic cellular structures.
Yes, it's really a curious system, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So, well, why don't we discuss from your perspective the reason why it's not the wisest strategy around to start indiscriminately lowering cholesterol, because it's a vital nutrient that we need, and it shouldn't be suppressed artificially.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, the first chapter of the book was written by Glenn Wainwright, who's a friend of mine. We're both members of THINKS, the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, which was founded by Uffe Ravenscoff. He's just amazing, and he's been fighting this battle for decades, and he's very persistent. And so Glenn Wainwright wrote that first chapter and also the foreword of the book. And that first chapter is very nice, and he talks all about this issue of how great cholesterol is. I mean, to think of cholesterol as public enemy number one is so strange. And I knew this also, when my husband was prescribed a statin, I knew cholesterol was vitally important to the body. And I knew that there was high concentrations in the brain, 2% of the body's weight and 25% of the body's cholesterol in the brain. So you don't want to mess with, losing cholesterol in the brain. And of course, statin side effects include a lot of cognitive issues. And that was one of the things that really faced Space Doc, Dwayne Graveline, the author of the book. He suffered something called transient global amnesia after taking statins for about 3 months. And, the doctor said, no way the statin could be causing that, but why don't you, but then he wanted to go off of it anyway, and it went away. And then a year later, the doctor said, well, the statin didn't cause it, so you should go back on the statin because you still have high cholesterol. He went back on it. And then shortly thereafter, he had another episode of transient global amnesia. And then from that point on, he stopped taking the statin. And then he became obsessed and wrote books, and he's written several books on statins. The first one was Lipitor, Thief of Memory. And I've read many of his books, at least 3 of them. And this one is great. And I'll show this one to you. I have it here, in case, the dark side of statins. His last book, very sad last chapter by his wife, recounting the last days of his life, which he died of ALS, or an ALS-like condition, which he always suspected that, the statins were contributory towards. He never came out and said statins caused my ALS, but he felt like, you got the sense that he felt like he wouldn't have had nearly as bad a problem with the ALS without the statins.
Yeah, well, it seems like the mechanism there might be again related to the dolichols, because they clearly are related to immune function.
Yeah, I know. And of course, the nerves, the nerves have a tremendous dependence on cholesterol, and dolichol also. Dolichol is really important in membranes, and it keeps membranes tight, and so that's another role that dolichol plays. And so in the coenzyme Q10, of course, the antioxidant effects, you start get the oxidative damage, in the nerves, the motor neurons. There's just, all bets are off. I mean, I think you see tremendous numbers of side effects related to muscle pain, muscle weakness, neuropathy, and you get a lot of evidence of aging, things like hearing loss, hair loss, arthritis. I think diabetes, what he says, and I agree with this, in the book, he says statins make you grow older faster. And I think that's a very good way to describe them. They sort of give you all the things you get when you get older faster. And since you never got old before, you don't know how fast you're supposed to get old. So you just think, well, I'm getting old. Like, this is just the way it is. And it's not. It should be much, much slower. But you don't know that because you never experienced it. This is your first time, you know? So everybody gets duped. Each person individually gets old fast and doesn't realize that's happening to them because of the statin.
Yeah. It's a very effective strategy if you want to grow old rapidly. Take a statin.
Right.
Take a statin, that's for sure. So let me see okay.
So yeah, we should get into inflammation because that's something that he talked quite a bit about, statins and inflammation, and sort of the studies that were done, and also showing that cholesterol is not the reason why whatever they do in terms of reducing heart attack is not due to lowering cholesterol. And that becomes clear.
Maybe due to the anti-inflammatory components, at least the benefit. So why don't you talk about inflammation and then enlighten us with the impact.
One thing I will admit is that I have not been able to figure out how statins how they reduce inflammation. I have not been able to figure that out. And I'm not sure anybody has. I mean, he sort of talked about it, and it didn't quite convince me, and I forget exactly even what he said. Because, well, he said it acts like NSAIDs. Like, actually, they had studies that showed that. So in terms of the evidence, it's there, that it reduces the activity of certain inflammatory agents, like C-reactive protein. So,
yeah, that is one of the best overall test of total body inflammation would be C-reactive protein, or HS-CRP, high sensitivity C-reactive protein.
Yes, that's right.
Ideally, it should be below 0.7. Anything above 1 is potentially problematic, and the higher it is, the worse it is.
Right, and it's an indicator of inflammation.
Yeah, I like to see it down to 0.2, 0.3.
Yeah, that's great if you can get that.
Yeah, so and you can typically, at least the people, for myself, I've been able to achieve that, and most people that I work with that are doing cyclical ketogenic diets,
that's
radically
great.
Because the ketones are a really potent histone deacetylase inhibitor, which is radically decreases inflammation.
That is super. I mean, that is really good. And of course, I agree with that ketogenic diet. That is so important. It's really, many people are catching on to that.
And I want to extend my sincere and deep appreciation and let people know that you were one of the expert reviewers for Fat for Fuel, and
thank you.
helped really make it much better. Yes.
Yeah. So inflammation. So for example, there was this study called, was it Ensure? I think there was a study in which they added an additional cholesterol lowering agent, which worked by disrupting cholesterol absorption through the gut, on top of a statin drug. And they got great numbers in terms of much lower cholesterol levels. And yay, right? That's great. But then they got absolutely no evidence of any improvement in the heart issues. So it's sort of like you got the cholesterol lower, but it didn't do anything to improve the heart attack risk. So that sort of says maybe lowering the cholesterol is not what the statins, it's not the part of what statins are doing that is causing them to reduce heart attack risk. And then on the other side of the coin was the C-reactive protein. They got this Jupiter study, which was a very controversial study because they stopped it early. And I've always wondered about that, why they did that. But the Jupiter study was C-reactive protein, and they took people who actually did not have high cholesterol, but did have high C-reactive protein. Those were the people that were put into this study. And they claimed to get terrific results. They had some, I forget the numbers, but great improvement in the relative risk of heart attack. And it got people on statins on the basis of C-reactive protein, to use that as the metric and say, okay, your cholesterol is fine, but still take a statin because you've got this high C-reactive protein. That was sort of another reason to take a statin. But his feeling was that it was the anti-inflammatory aspect of the statins that was their only benefit. And he felt it was a benefit. And he actually advocated he said, I would even recommend that someone take a statin in a tiny dose, like say 2 milligrams, 2 instead of 10 or 20. So normally you would have maybe 20, but just take 2.
80% less.
Just take a tiny
95%.
A tiny bit of statin, that you could get 70% of the improvement in the anti-inflammatory effect with 1/10 doses, that kind of thing. Much lower dosage could get you 70% of what you would get with a higher dosage without lowering your cholesterol, which is what you don't want to do. So he thought there might be justification in taking a statin for that purpose.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear that this is not a strategy that I'd agree with in any way, shape, or form. It does help justify people who are taking it that they may achieve some benefit, but clearly there are so many other simple, less expensive, safe strategies to decrease inflammation. And we talked about it earlier, the cyclical ketogenic diet, but there's other things that you can do too. I mean, this is not a tough nut to crack. It's pretty easy, and certainly taking a statin isn't worth it when you consider that at least traditional doses, and maybe it would be less at the lower doses, that they admit 10% of people have side effects from statin, but the reality is probably closer to 30% or even higher.
Yes.
And that's recognized side effects. That's not the damage that it's causing to each and every person that's taking it. It's not, from the very mechanisms we mentioned earlier.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I totally agree with you. I would not recommend, personally, I don't think, I would never take a statin under any circumstance. I just feel it's a poison, and I'm done with it. It's just, there's too much, anything that's going to do what it does in terms of messing up the mevalonate pathway at its base and all the different things that come out of that pathway. Of course, it includes vitamin D, and I think you maybe mentioned that, but vitamin D comes out of that pathway too, because it comes from the cholesterol. And as
it's definitely right. The other hormones, right? The critical hormones, like progesterone, testosterone, aldosterone, cortisol.
Exactly.
And vitamin D.
Vitamin D, yes. I mean, it's amazing to think that you would want to reduce all of those things. Why would you want to do that? It's just insane, seems to me.
So let's take a little side trail here, because we have some time and you're an expert on this and we haven't talked about it for a while, and maybe your views have changed since the last time we discussed it. But on vitamin D, you really had enlightened the world, and basically you and you alone pioneered this concept that it's not necessarily vitamin D, but it's vitamin D that's sulfated, which occurs typically and most traditionally when you're expose your skin to sun. So why don't you have your views change on this? And if they have,
I still believe that. And in fact, I believe cholesterol sulfate is probably more important than vitamin D sulfate. And I think vitamin D is more of a messenger. So when you are exposed to sunlight and your skin produces vitamin D sulfate, it also produces much more cholesterol sulfate. And that cholesterol sulfate gets shipped out into the blood. It goes into the membranes of the particles. So for example, the LDL particles, the HDL particles, cholesterol sulfate enters those membranes and makes them safe. It actually builds the sulfate, is crucial, because it builds this structured water, this Jerry Pollock structured water gel, sort of like a Superman shield around that particle, so that it can't be attacked by sugar and oxidative damage. It keeps the inside content safe. And so you don't get oxidized fats and oxidized cholesterol. You don't damage those tissues. You don't damage the red blood cells. The red blood cells also have cholesterol sulfate in their membranes. They make cholesterol sulfate and they put it in their membrane, and it gives them that shield, and also gives them the negative charge that makes everything repel each other, so that things don't glom up together in the blood. So the cholesterol sulfate is super, super important. It's present in the blood at pretty high concentrations. DHEA sulfate is another similar. DHEA sulfate is derived from cholesterol sulfate, or from cholesterol.
I did not know that.
Yeah, cholesterol goes into the adrenal glands, and then it goes through this big complicated process, and the DHEA comes out, and then it gets sulfated again, and then sent out as DHEA sulfate. So DHEA sulfate is a sort of modified form of cholesterol sulfate. And all of the hormones, too, are also sulfated in transit. Estrone sulfate and progesterone sulfate and testosterone sulfate, and even other things besides the sterols, like the neurotransmitters, melatonin sulfate, serotonin sulfate. They're all sulfated in transit, and vitamin D sulfate.
So this is the transportable form and not the biologically active form, the sulfate.
Exactly. When it's sulfated, all of these things have that property. Very interesting. When they're sulfated, they're inactive, and vitamin D as well. Vitamin D sulfate is, doesn't do anything. 5% of the capacity of vitamin D to, for example, promote calcium uptake. All the things that vitamin D does, vitamin D sulfate does not do. And that's one reason why people dismiss it. They say, well, the stuff's useless. It doesn't do anything. But what it's doing is carrying sulfate.
Okay.
And that's what I think is key.
And because it's sulfated, it's water soluble, because all these
Right.
steroid hormones are fat soluble, so it makes it water soluble, so it can be transported by the blood. Once it
Yes.
gets to the tissue where it needs to work, they take the sulfate out and bang, it works.
Yes, and the sulfate gets delivered, which is extremely important. It's
Ah,
a
that's the other part
sulfate
of the equation.
carrier. Sulfate gets
Ah, so it's a
delivered.
dual prong approach. Not only does it carry the biologically active precursor, but it also delivers sulfate.
Yes, and this is something that very few people realize. I think it's crucial. I think all of these things are involved with sulfate transport, and I think sulfate is actually very difficult to transport for the very reason that it will gel the blood. So sulfate, has this property of forming structured water, and the blood needs to flow. So you can't have, lots of sulfate floating around in the blood because it'll mess it up. And so the blood it confines the sulfate levels to a very narrow margin in the blood. If there's too much free sulfate in the blood, it'll flush it right out of the kidneys. It'll throw it away.
Okay. In your experience, though, and review of the literature, do you believe that most people just simply don't have enough sulfate? It's not they have an excess they have to excrete, they just don't have enough to begin with.
Yes, I think we have a massive sulfate deficiency problem in this country right now. I think many of the diseases that we face can be traced to sulfate deficiency. And I think that it's being caused in large part by glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup.
Another area of your expertise that
Yes.
is really, certainly statins are an issue. And, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I want to mention it now. Why is this important? 1 in 4 Americans over the age of 40 are taking a statin drug.
That's incredible. That's just incredible.
That is, and it may be even more. It might be going down to 1 in 3.
And children are taking them too. Children under 10 years old. It is so shocking. It is so shocking.
Oh God, I did not know that. I didn't even know they were allowed to be taking them. But why am I surprised?
Insane, absolutely insane. I can't believe that's the worst thing you could do to a child coming into puberty is to take away their cholesterol. It's unbelievable.
It's criminal. It's absolutely criminal.
It's absolutely criminal.
And they should have their license taken away. I mean, there's just no doubt in my mind. I mean, there's just no way that should be allowed.
It's an insane world.
It's a standard of care, so they can get away with it.
Oh, and in fact, if they don't, right, they're going to say, well, you're not treating properly. They're going to beat you out.
So, but the other thing is the glyphosate, and that's what your major. Well, before we go into glyphosate, I want to touch on the sulfates again, because you weren't a big fan of sulfate oral supplementation like MSM or those.
Actually, I'm changing my mind perhaps on MSM because I'm getting a lot of people telling me that it's worked really great for them. And so I'm thinking
initially, initially you weren't.
Well, I didn't even understand how it worked because I couldn't find literature that talked about what actually happened to the MSM. Like, was the sulfur in it even bioavailable? It's a methyl sulfonyl methane. And was it even possible to get sulfate out of that? I wasn't sure. I couldn't find literature. I still can't find literature on exactly what happens to MSM. It's kind of interesting.
Well, it's a derivative of DMSO. They're really similar. Right. Whatever works for DMSO, it's going to work for MSM. And
right, I agree.
I think Stanley Jacobs is the initial investigator that popularized it.
It has to be the case that it's accessible sulfur, and it also has methyls, which is interesting too, because methylation is another thing that's depleted by glyphosate. Glyphosate disrupts methionine synthesis by gut microbes and by plants, and so you get methionine deficiency. And methionine, of course, is the core of the sulfur-containing amino acids, and it's going to be needed to make glutathione. Glutathione is a really important antioxidant in the liver. So, and then methionine provides those methyl groups for the methyl transfers. And so I think there's a methylation deficiency problem as well as a sulfate deficiency problem in the context of glyphosate.
Some people are concerned about taking too much methionine, especially if you eat a lot of animal products. Do you have any concern about that?
I don't know. I don't actually like the idea of taking free amino acids in general.
Sure.
Like, I think taurine is really, really important, but taurine can actually cause seizures if you take free taurine, like in what's it called?
Really?
Yeah. It can cause seizures. Because your body's not used to having these amino acids available as free amino acids in the blood at too high a level. They can cause funny things to happen. And so I would hesitate.
Well, let's go back to magnesium again. And your preferred one initially was Epsom salts, or soaking in Epsom salts.
Yes.
And I've recently encountered a prescription, but a sort of a formula for converting magnesium sulfate into a lotion that you can apply topically, because
That sounds
I don't
interesting.
know about people, but I just don't find the time, or
Yeah.
primarily the time to draw a bath and then sit in it. I mean, I just got so many other things going on in practice. I would love to do that, and I'm absolutely in favor of it, but it would seem to be a more efficient way would be to rub it on. And I'm wondering if you have
Yes, I
any.
think
I
so.
mean,
In fact, I remember talking to the father of an autistic child who said that they just made a kind of a paste out of the Epsom salt baths, I believe, and just put it on the child's arm, and they felt that that was
yeah,
effective for absorbing it. Sulfate is interesting because there's a problem in the gut. A lot of people have sulfur sensitivities, and people were sending me email and saying, I can't take sulfur; it makes me sick. And I was, for the longest time, I was puzzled by that, and I finally sort of realized that I think that's again because of glyphosate, because it disrupts critical enzymes involved in detoxifying sulfite, both sulfite oxidase and sulfite reductase. There's an enzyme that takes sulfite and turns it into methionine, actually. And that enzyme in E. coli was shown to be suppressed by glyphosate. And then sulfite oxidase depends upon molybdenum, which is one of the minerals that would get chelated by glyphosate because it's a +2 cation. Glyphosate holds on to these minerals and makes them lose their bioavailability. So the sulfite oxidase and the sulfite reductase are both broken. Sulfite has to be cleared really fast because it's highly reactive. So it slows down the ability to clear the sulfite, and that causes toxicity in the gut. I think because of the glyphosate. So again, people who have sulfur sensitivities, I would love to find out if they could switch to an organic diet and fix the problem. I would predict that might be true.
Yeah, unfortunately, now we also have a good test for glyphosate, a urine test that's not horribly expensive. It's available for under $100.
Yes.
And you can find out where you're at. A simple test, a urine test, no blood stick required, no spitting, just pee on a stick, I think, or send a sample in of your urine, and they'll tell you. I had mine done, and it was tested below the level of detection,
Excellent.
which is 40 parts per trillion. But it's something I would definitely recommend, because you've done such a great work in helping us understand the damage that glyphosate does. I mean, it's just such an atrocious compound put on to the earth at 5 billion pounds per
It's
year.
unbelievable. It's just unbelievable.
Insane. I mean, we're going to look back and say, how do we let them do this?
I know.
And it's caused so much damage. And so because of it, I didn't realize it bound to all the +2 cations. Would that include magnesium too?
Absolutely. It's been shown to deplete magnesium. It depletes a lot of the minerals in plants, so they become deficient in manganese, magnesium, zinc. I mean, these are really important micronutrients that your food is going to be deficient if your food's been exposed to glyphosate. And then, of course, your gut bacteria will also not be able to get access to those minerals if the glyphosate's in the gut. And that will cause them to be sick. And then it goes from there. There was a study on cows, and they found in particular manganese and cobalt, extremely low levels, way below the minimum expected value in cows exposed to glyphosate in the blood. So,
but fortunately, I think the end result of this is that we're educating the public, that making them aware of it. Obviously, we've been successful in California, at least putting a poison label.
I love California.
Which is good. Some progress. I think we will. The key point here is to educate people, inform them, let them know that they can take control of their health by choosing organic, but even better, because it could be raining glyphosate, and it is raining glyphosate. We've got so much in the environment. You can grow your own food or buy it from a local organic farmer at your farmer's market, or even, you can grow sprouts in your house. I mean, that's the key thing. If we can start growing our own food, taking back the production system. I mean, we grew almost half of our crops in World War II with Victory Gardens.
Yeah,
but now it's less than 1%.
We really need to do that. I totally support that. I think it's great that you're promoting that concept. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, it is key. It's part of the solution strategy that we get, because if we can convince enough people to do it, then there won't be a market for this. They can't do it. I mean, they'll still probably contaminate the feed for the animals, but most, you don't need to eat a lot of animal products. I mean, it's not much. You know, certainly a lot less than most people are eating now.
Oh, and the animals, of course, are getting sick too. There's actually a lot of stuff
Oh,
going on
absolutely.
with the cows and the pigs. It's amazing. And they're discovering this, things are coming out both in America and in Europe. This guy, E. Paterson, is a massive pig farmer. He has a huge number of pigs. And he did studies with, he saw deformed piglets and fertility problems and all kinds of issues with his pigs. And he converted them to an organic diet and everything went away. It was amazing. They were getting Clostridium infections. They were getting botulism. And they were having a lot of problems. They all went away when they were converted to an organic diet for the pigs. And same with the cows. So I think we should be learning from the animals because they're getting a much higher exposure than we are. But our exposure is going up every year. So we're catching up, and we're getting sicker and sicker too. Our population is just incredible how much healthcare is costing in America. And we never seem to ask, why is our healthcare so expensive? Maybe it's because we're sick. We don't seem to ask that question.
No, being sick is part of it, but I think the primary issue is that we've allowed corporations to benefit their bottom line dollar. So that's about half of it probably comes from there. But then the other is exposure to the two most pernicious toxins, I believe, that are out there, at least one would be glyphosate and the other is EMF.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a really powerful synergy that takes people out prematurely.
Yes, I agree. I think glyphosate messes up your natural electrical system, which makes you much more susceptible to the EMF electrical noise.
Yeah, which is electrosmog, as they refer to it in Europe.
It really sounds.
We are highly polluted.
Sounds daunting.
Yeah, it's
to try to fix
interesting.
the problems.
I want to give you a question because I don't think even you have a deep appreciation of the increase in the magnitude of exposure that we have. If you go back to 1917, right around World War II, and to now, 2017, as we're recording this, right before 2018, 100 years essentially, what has the increase been in microwave radiation, 1 gigahertz?
Oh boy.
From 1917, did it go up 10 times, 100,
Oh my
1,000, a
God.
million, a
Oh my
billion?
God. I don't know,
Yeah,
but I imagine it's big, really big.
it is big. Well, you are correct. It is big. And the answer is, it's not a billion. It's a billion billion.
Oh my God.
It's went up
Oh
10
my
to the
God.
18th.
That's
10 to the
incredible.
18th. Yeah, 10 with 18 zeros after it.
Wow.
The 1 with 18. But that's a lot. Yes.
That is really a lot. Frightening, isn't it? It's really interesting how we've become so dependent on this communication network that we've created, and to think of just taking that away. And even though we didn't have it 100 years ago, and that was fine, we still seem to live happy lives, right? But to say go back to that, it's interesting to think about how hard that would be for us. I think it's almost harder than going back to organic food, don't you think?
No, I think it's relatively easy because no one's suggesting that we abandon technology. I'm certainly not suggesting that, but it's just to avoid the wireless component of technology, which is relatively easy to do. You do it all wired, and it's just atrocious that they're putting children on statin drugs, which is just criminal. But it's equally criminal to put an entire classroom on tablets or iPads.
Right.
And expose them to that radiation. I mean, it's just insane once you understand the damage that's occurring.
Yes.
I mean, they're equally criminal activities.
Right.
From a health perspective, once you understand health at a foundational level.
Yes, and it just takes such a long time to get people to realize what's happening with all of these things.
Well, yeah, but you're taking a good stab at helping people understand. Thanks for all the good work.
So are you.
So what are there any new insights you've acquired? And I'm sure there are since the last time we've talked about this, because you're always reading. That's what I love about you. You're scouring the literature and absorbing this new information, and not only just reading and learning, but then synthesizing, understanding it, and applying it in a practical recommendations.
Yes, I mean, well, the glyphosate, I've really been obsessed. I've continued to be obsessed with glyphosate.
Mm-hmm.
It's such an interesting molecule, and I'm figuring out all the different nuances of its behavior. It's just incredible, everything that it does. I think that I'm much better understanding how it causes leaky gut. It causes the gut to leak. Mm-hmm. I believe it gets into proteins by mistake in place of glycine. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of circumstantial evidence that this is happening. And then those proteins become much more allergenic than they would otherwise be. It gets into trypsin. Anthony Samsel showed, he ordered porcine trypsin and porcine pepsin from a lab, and he tested them. Both of them tested for high levels of glyphosate. So it's getting into the trypsin and messing up the trypsin's function to digest the proteins.
Yeah, trypsin is a digestive enzyme.
Yeah, so the proteins are not getting digested. The gut is opening up holes, the leaks. The undigested proteins, such as the gluten and the casein, is getting out into the general circulation. The immune cells are having a fit because of that, and you get autoimmune disease. So we have an epidemic in all kinds of different autoimmune diseases. And allergies, food allergies, I think all of that traces back to glyphosate.
Yeah, and let's just step back a bit and help people understand how is it getting into glycine. First of all, glycine is a really short, small, tiny amino acid. It's I think one of the most common amino acids.
Yes, it's common. And it's also the smallest amino acid, no side chains.
Yeah, no side chains. So what most people don't know, glyphosate, what does GLY stand for? That stands for glycine.
It does. Glycine.
It is glyphosate is it is a step of understanding to recognize how this molecule can easily be substituted for normal glycine. So why don't you expand on that?
It is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, except that the nitrogen has this attachment to it, which is called this methylphosphonyl group. So it's got this thing stuck onto the nitrogen atom that makes it a modified glycine molecule, but it's still glycine. It's still the amino acid glycine, just has something on the nitrogen. So I think that it still can go into the protein when the protein's being made, and the DNA machinery says there's a code here for glycine. It's looking around for a glycine molecule. It's, oh, this one's a good glycine, put it in. And it's not glycine. It's glycine plus, it's glycine on steroids. It's got this extra thing.
It's poison glycine.
Exactly. And it can cause huge problems with that. Certain proteins have certain glycines that absolutely have to be glycine in order for them to work properly. I mean, a good example is myosin. Myosin in the muscles is muscle contraction. You know, it's a really important protein in the muscles for contracting, for movement. It has a glycine at position 699 in the protein, in the amino acid sequence. If you change that glycine into alanine, which is to say you add one extra methyl group, it ruins the protein. It only has 1% capacity to contract. It loses 99% of its capacity to contract. Really amazing. So if you put glyphosate instead of glycine, you're going to have at least as bad an effect as you would with alanine, probably worse. It will cripple the protein. And maybe that's how you get chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, different options for that. But yeah, a lot of people don't appreciate it. But if you're taking biochemistry, you have. But frequently, as you mentioned, it's just a one amino acid substitution that can totally ruin an entire protein, consisting of thousands of amino acids. You change one of them, is ruined.
Yeah, and it's just particular ones, and people know which ones, and that's what's so cool. I had a lot of fun rummaging through the research literature looking for essential glycines. You know, you sort of find a protein, here's a glycine, here's a mutation, this is no longer glycine, now it's aspartate. All of a sudden, this person has this horrible disease because of that one change, you know. And ALS, for example, I did a whole paper on ALS because there's a whole bunch of different mutations in certain proteins that are associated with you know, the familial form of ALS, the inherited form, which is only 5% of the cases. But in those cases, you have a lot of examples of glycine mutations within certain proteins that are linked to ALS, causing ALS. So it isn't hard to think that glycine is not mutated, but it's substituted by glyphosate. It has the same effect.
I did not realize. So there's really basically two types or classes of ALS. One is a familial, and the other is an acquired.
Yes.
Did not know that. That would make perfect sense for the glyphosate story, because you know, having interviewed Stephen Gundry, who wrote the book The Plant Paradox, and I'm sure you've been exposed to that. You know, his approach for virtually all autoimmune diseases, of which ALS is a subtype of, is to remove lectins from the diet, and because they damage the gut lining, as does glyphosate. And of course, he recommends a GMO-free, glyphosate-free diet, but he said using some very sophisticated tests to document it objectively.
Yes.
Yeah. So I did not. But there could be. So even with it, lectin-free diet, if you're exposed to glyphosate, you're going to be ruined.
I think so. I think and collagen has huge amounts of glycine in it, and we have an epidemic in joint pain, back pain. You know, all these knee pain, all these hip replacement therapies. I think that they're, and of course, opioid drug epidemic, because of people being in agony, they're taking painkillers and ending up dying from an overdose of opioid drugs. I suspect all of that is connected to glyphosate getting into critical proteins in the joints and messing up their ability to do their job properly.
Yes, indeed. So
we got off topic.
that's okay. All right, because that's an area of expertise. But ultimately, it's an important topic with the cholesterol and the statins, because
it is.
And interestingly, that was your segue into this whole arena. You would have never been studying glyphosate if it wasn't for statins. So
absolutely,
it's the tip of the iceberg, and I suspect for most people, we're preaching to the choir. They understand the dangers of statins. It's their friends and relatives and neighbors and coworkers who just don't get it and are absolutely, and why should they? 1 in 4 Americans, as I said, maybe moving to 1 in 3, over 40 are taking statins. So it's
amazing
an enormous number of people. And there's just, my guess, my conclusion is, or summary, it may be in the more accurate term, is that virtually no one benefits from taking statins.
I agree.
Shouldn't be taken by anyone. Now, Dr. Stephen Sinatra, who just was with us last week, and is a cardiologist in his natural medicine, but he believes there's a certain subset of individuals who benefit. I don't know enough, but my concern is I think there's better and safer ways to address the risk factors, reducing.
I agree. I mean, aspirin, for example, is an anti-inflammatory. If you want to take an anti-inflammatory, just take aspirin. It's a lot less destructive than a statin drug.
Yeah, but there's so many other natural products that are.
No, I wouldn't take an aspirin either.
No, I wouldn't take aspirin either. No way. I mean, but
I did want to say I have on a page here.
I do take white willow bark.
Yeah, there you go. Yes.
I take some of that every morning. I was going to maybe show this page because I think you're interested in what supplements that you might take, and he has a section, a chapter on dietary supplements in this book, in Dave Drain's book, and I have here some of the things he recommends, which are interesting. Coenzyme Q10, of course, taking there's a debate on that. Many people, and I'm one of them, believe that the ubiquinol version, or the reduced version, is a little more effective, and that's the one I personally take.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's good information.
So they're this. Coenzyme Q10 is the oxidized version.
Right. It's very interesting because it's the same thing with folic acid versus folate.
Yeah. Is that? I knew folate was the natural version, but folic acid is the oxidized folate.
Absolutely, it's the same problem.
I did not know that.
It's interesting.
I knew I knew that was a synthetic version.
Yeah.
Folate was the natural, but I didn't know it was an oxidized and reduced version.
Right. Folic acid actually costs you a lot of antioxidant capacity in the liver to turn it into folate. It's not good stuff.
And speaking of folate, I'm sure you like 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate rather than folate itself.
That's right. Both the methyl
5-MTFHF.
Right. So folic acid, you have to get rid of the oxidation. So that's going to cost you antioxidant capacity. And then you have to methylate it. So that's going to cost you methylation capacity. Both of those you don't have because glyphosate has been destroying both of them. So folic acid makes things worse in the context of glyphosate, I think.
Yeah. And interestingly,
in the wheat.
That's in every prenatal vitamin, or not every, but most every commercial prenatal vitamin.
Absolutely.
Absolutes are rarely true, and it's certainly true here. So, be careful out there if you're pregnant. Don't take folic acid.
Right. That's a big one. Then he says vitamin C, which I think you also like, right?
I'm not a massive fan of vitamin C, and I know it might distress some people. Unless you're sick, then I think the liposomal version, which you can take orally, which is probably even better than intravenous, and I would take 4 every hour until you're better. And I just was at an event last week, and I gave a woman who actually, Annie Brandt, who has the best answers for cancer, she had an allergic reaction to something, took it, and literally within hours it was gone.
That's amazing.
So it'll abort allergic reactions. It'll radically upregulate your immune system, and it's a very powerful, inexpensive, virtually no side effects. So I love vitamin C. I'm not a big fan of taking it every day, and I eat fruits which are very high in vitamin C.
Yes.
I grow acerola cherries, and
it's
I harvest
them. It's nice to see that you're saying do it naturally, which is what I've always said too, as you know. I like to get things through foods.
I might eat 100 acerola cherries, and each one has 80 milligrams. So I might be getting 8,000 milligrams of vitamin C from the cherries.
But in the context of the whole food, which is really important. In the context of the whole food,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
So then he says selenium. So selenium is another thing that gets messed up, selenoproteins by glyphosate. I mean, by the statin drugs, selenoproteins. And so he says,
Yeah. And
take selenium.
I'm a massive, that is an absolutely critical or vital, not critical, but vital mineral or the nutrient that I think almost everyone needs to be on: selenium, primarily for glutathione, but it has many
Yes,
other uses.
right.
And
Lecithin, how about
thyroid health.
lecithin? He says lecithin.
I'm not a big fan of lecithin, and I would suggest as a substitute for that just to eat one whole egg a day,
There you
because
go. I agree with that.
lecithin is phosphatidylcholine, and there's massive amounts in egg
Yes,
yolk. A
yes.
whole egg, the egg yolk is better, and I put a whole egg in my smoothie pretty much every day. Unless I'm
Mm,
working out and training, then I use 2 eggs. So and it's a magnificent tool. You really need phosphatidylcholine. I'm an absolute firm believer, and you could take it supplementally. I think a liposomal form is better than just swallowing
mm-hmm,
plain lecithin. And you got to be careful with lecithin because most of it's from soy. A lot of it is from GMO
mm-hmm. That's
soy.
right.
So we use safflower or sunflower lecithin, organic sunflower lecithin. So
Important
it's a
because
whole.
sunflowers can be contaminated too. They can be sprayed right
Yeah.
before
So
harvest.
it's a whole different deal. But I'm a big fan of phosphatidylcholine. I think it really helps, and you could even use it, especially in detox, in very large amounts to help penetrate your membranes. You need it for so many vital functions.
Yes. Okay. And then he says omega-3, of course, omega-3 fats, which
Yeah. Now,
eat those fatty foods that have high omega-3, such as
well, it's
grass-fed
not
beef.
just fatty foods. It's well, I'm not a big fan of grass-fed beef for getting omega-3 fats. I think the better one would be seafood, healthy
Yes.
seafood. My two favorites are um, sardines,
Yes.
which is where I get most of them from. I do use wild caught shrimp, really tiny ones, so they aren't
Great.
grown up enough to get a lot of uh,
That's
pesticides
interesting.
and
That's a
dioxins.
good
And
idea.
then I also use fish roe, salmon roe. So
Very good.
I have a teaspoon of that every day,
Oh,
and
wow.
you just like glyphosate, which the urine test, which we have on our site, you can also 3 index, which we also have on our site, and it's a little blood stick, and you can tell the percentage of omega-3 you have versus omega-6, and you can see your healthy ranges. And that's a good test that if you're really interested in health, that I would recommend anyone who is to get that test to see where you are, to see if in fact you're not diluting yourself. Now, if you can't have seafood for whatever reason, then I would highly recommend taking a healthy source, supplemental source. I'm a bigger fan of krill oil than
Yeah.
fish oil, but you got to take enough to so you can change the omega-3 index.
Very good. Wow, this is great. D-ribose. I know you like you. I remember that's the
Well,
mountain. D-ribose.
you changed my view on that. We had an
I
email
know.
exchange not too
Yes.
long ago, and you this was a glycan agent, and then I talked to some other clinicians, and I radically lowered my dose, but I take about maybe a few thousand milligrams once a day, really like a half a teaspoon a day.
Mm.
Uh, and I put that in my smoothie.
Hmm.
So it may be glycan, but I think ribose is an important
It
nutrient that
is.
you
I
need.
know. It's interesting.
It's
My fear.
part of DNA. But if you
Yes,
get too much, it's glycating.
and I think the statin drugs make it more necessary to take it because I think it's something in what the statins does messes up the D-ribose processing.
Did not
And
know
then
that.
magnesium, he says, and then alpha lipoic acid.
Oh,
Oh, magnesium.
well, but let's get back. Magnesium, most everyone listening to this is deficient, and that's based on conventional standards. And you may not understand this, but the primary mechanism proposed by Martin Pall, Pall, and
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen any of his YouTube lectures, but they're magnificent. And it basically describes the molecular pathology of how EMFs actually cause their
Yes.
action, ultimately resulting in,
Nitric oxide, right?
well, nitric oxide, superoxide dismutase combining, and then forming peroxynitrate to form oxidative free radicals and hydroxyl free radicals. But the big issue is it's all mediated through these voltage gated calcium channels. And guess what? A calcium channel, it can be blocked by a calcium channel blocker, and a natural one is magnesium. So when you take high enough doses of magnesium, you are actually lowering your risk for developing damage from EMFs.
And that's actually really interesting too, because calcification of the plaque is a big part of heart disease. Calcification is really a more serious problem than the cholesterol buildup. And that calcification is going to be caused by the EMFs.
And we go back to the statins.
Yes.
What do statins do? They impair the ability of vitamin K2 absorption or its effect to work. So if you're messing up vitamin K2, that's exactly what K2 does. It's calcification of the arteries. It puts calcium in, prevents it from going into the arteries, and puts it back into the bones.
And in fact, there's a paper I have that shows that calcification increases with statin drug exposure.
Exactly what you predict.
Yeah.
Because it's blocking the K2 pathway.
Right. Alpha lipoic acid, that's a good one because it's got sulfur.
It is a good one. I'm a little concerned about that one because it probably is good. You have to use it discriminately because it's an oral antioxidant, and I'm becoming less enamored with it as I grow older with
Uh-huh.
oral antioxidants because I like it. I'm not sure if you've studied the literature on molecular hydrogen.
Yes, well,
That
you've
that
got me
that is,
into that. I'm still trying to
oh,
figure that out.
it's you will love it, and Tyler LeBaron he is really just very knowledgeable in this. But essentially, it's a selective antioxidant inhibitor, and uh, and it really the primary mechanism we think it upregulates NRF2 pathway, so it
Hmm.
makes you make your own superoxide dismutase, the ones that you need. So maybe it's better to get the sulfur and then have your body make them, because your body can regulate it on feedback, and it does. And if you indiscriminately increase antioxidants, you may be shutting down important
Yes,
oxidant
I'm
stressors
glad to
because
hear
you
you
need
say
some.
that.
You need some oxidant. You need some free
Yes,
radicals.
I
They're not
absolutely.
all dangerous.
Well, you have to have them. It's the thing. You have to be able
Yeah,
to do that. And what you want to have is a good support system to tamper down the damage, collateral damage, but you still want to be able to
right.
have that reaction actually take place. If you
Which is what
suppress the
molecular
reaction.
hydrogen does.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it doesn't suppress most of them, just like the hydroxyl free radicals.
And then he has one more, pyrroloquinoline, quinone, which I've never heard of. So
Oh
I
no,
don't know
no,
if you
that's
know about that one.
oh yeah, I've been taking it for 2 years or so.
Oh, wow.
It's more commonly called PQQ.
Oh, okay, PQQ.
It's similar. It's sort of a sister to coenzyme Q10. It
Mm.
functions. It's in the same similar type of mechanism. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of that. In fact, we sell a combination of that with berberine, and I'm sure you've heard that many people use metformin, which is a
Yes.
relatively safe diabetic drug for anti-aging, and they also use it to control. Obviously, it's an oral hypoglycemia to use to control diabetes. But interestingly, berberine works almost in the same pathways, primarily AMPK, that metformin does, without the
Mm.
side effects like
It's a
damaging
natural.
B12. Yeah, so we have a berberine PQQ combination that I think is
Oh,
just
that sounds very
magnificent.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So for just for health support, because it improves mitochondrial function.
Right. That's great. I'm glad I gave you that
Yeah.
list. I'm interviewing you. We've reversed roles. But that was very
Well,
interesting.
it's good stuff, that we because supplements are important, and I think, and I take a lot of supplements. There's no question, but my primary goal is to get it from food. And many of my supplements they're food-based
Yes,
supplements.
you're
Like
looking more towards
fermented
natural things.
chlorella, yeah, the acerola cherries. So, it's things like that. But I do take a fair amount, like PQQ would be one, and ubiquinol,
Hmm.
magnesium. So I think it's important, but to be really careful and choose
Hmm.
them wisely, and not just go overboard and take everything.
Yes, very good advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, any other insights you'd like to share with us, because you're just such an enormous wealth of information?
Oh gosh, I could go on and on forever,
What
but
would
I
you,
think, uh,
but some of the
yeah.
new stuff that you'd like to emphasize.
Right. I mean, I'm having a lot of fun figuring out the way the mess up in the gut with the glyphosate. I think is really what I'm working on right now, and the whole thing of the imbalance in the gut microbes, overgrowth of things like Clostridium, and then the immune system getting messed up, and not being able. The immune system gets weakened by glyphosate. The neutrophils are unable to do their job. And then the tryptophan gets squirreled away inside the macrophages as kynurenine, and then it gets taken over to the brain and dumped off and causing all kinds of trouble in the brain. So there's this whole complicated thing that's going on between the brain and the gut-brain axis communication system, with the microbes being messed up by the glyphosate, the gut being leaky, and the leaky gut barrier introduces a leaky brain barrier. So the barriers are all leaky. The placental barrier is leaky too, so the placenta gets in trouble during pregnancy. All this stuff that's happening because of glyphosate. It's such a cascade. It's just truly amazing. It's so complicated, and I'm struggling to try to organize it into individual papers that make sense, because the space is vast, and it just goes on and on.
Oh,
But I think the tryptophan deficiency caused both by the shikimate pathway being broken, because shikimate pathway is what the bugs use to make the tryptophan, which is this essential amino acid. Tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin and melatonin. So those are going to be deficient if tryptophan's deficient. Glyphosate prevents the synthesis of tryptophan by the microbes, and then it also forces the tryptophan into the macrophages. So they squirrel it away, and it makes this deficiency problem even worse with respect to the serotonin.
Well, how about the plants they were eating, which I think ultimately is a source? Although Robert Lustig told me the highest source of tryptophan was egg whites.
Oh, that's interesting.
Never looked it up. So that's when I started eating the whole egg again instead of just the yolks. But I'm wondering, when you spray glyphosate on the crops,
yes,
because
it depletes.
It's just disrupts the shikimate pathway. Does it? Because is that correct?
Yeah, it's going to deplete the shikimate. It's going to mess up the shikimate pathway in the plant, which is going to deplete the supply of tryptophan in the food source. So you have a deficiency. Actually, Anthony and I talked about this in our first paper that we wrote together on glyphosate, the first Pathways to Modern Disease series, the first of the series. We've written 6 papers so far. And in the first one of the series, we talked about this tryptophan deficiency in the food, and then tryptophan being unable to be produced by the microbes, and tryptophan being taken up by the macrophages to fight the infection that's there because the microbes are disrupted. So you get into the situation where the tryptophan gets totally depleted, and the liver doesn't get enough tryptophan, then it can't make enough NAD because that depends on tryptophan.
Oh,
and so you have NAD deficiency, and
that is one of the most important signaling molecules in the body.
Yeah, so that's a problem. And then you get also the serotonin and melatonin deficiency in the brain, which gives you the sleep disorder. And of course, serotonin deficiency gives you violent behavior, suicidal behavior, depression.
And it's not just tryptophan, is it? Tryptophan is an aromatic amino acid.
Yes.
Doesn't disruption of the shikimate pathway decrease all the aromatic amino acids?
Tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine, all 3. And then all their derivatives, which includes dopamine and melanin, the skin tanning agent. Folic acid even comes out of that pathway. Folate. I mean, so many things are disrupted by that pathway, which is why the plant dies. It really does kill the plant very effectively. It kills all plants, except for those engineered.
Clearly, that is a strong reason to avoid ever eating conventional food. And most of the time, you got to realize any non-organic meat is going to be loaded with glyphosate because that's what they're feeding them. They're feeding them non-organic food,
right?
And it's loaded up. So clearly eating organically, especially any animal food, is important. But I'm wondering if you could comment on your experience, and I'm sure you've met Zach Bush before he developed this product Restore, with respect to its impact and its ability to actually repair some of the disruption of the tight junctions in the gut.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, it makes sense as a product because it's got the minerals. So the minerals are getting depleted by the glyphosate. So it's the mineral supplements. It's also got the fulvic acid and the humic acid from the soil. He claims he gets this incredibly rich and healthy soil. I mean, it's really important.
Yeah, from 50 million years old in southeast.
Yes, right? I think that's a crucial part. It's not just any soil. So it's always interesting with these products that it has to be really perfect, the best that you can find. And so, and then it has also probiotics. So it makes sense because it's got all those things in it that I think are useful for helping to detoxify.
As I understand, it doesn't have probiotics. It's just this teralignite is what they have, and essentially, it radically decreases the need for probiotics. And it
maybe more like prebiotics.
Yeah, I don't even think it's prebiotics. I think it just improves microbial communication.
Oh, interesting.
And allows a greater microbial diversity, is my understanding of it.
You did an interview with him, I think, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. He's actually a good friend of mine. I'm going to be visiting his
he's invited me to visit. We should go at the same time.
Yeah, I'm going to be there this week. So, I've been there before. He's just a great human being, and
he tipped me off to zonulin too, and that's another piece of the puzzle. And he probably talked to you about zonulin.
Yeah, absolutely.
And zonulin gets induced by glyphosate because the glyphosate disrupts the protein digestion, so the gluten comes down and doesn't get digested, and that triggers the release of zonulin. And what's worse than that is that zonulin is removed by trypsin, the digestive enzyme, which is broken by glyphosate also. So that once the zonulin is produced, it's going to open up the gut barrier, and then it's going to hang around because the trypsin's not working. So that the gut barrier is going to stay open much too long.
Okay, well, this is good. I think we've given people earful in this last
I'm
hour
sure
or
it's more
so.
than they can handle
So
at this point.
yeah, so I think we'll probably get ready to close. And let's remind people that the book that we were initially discussing was the book, The Dark Sides of Statins,
Yeah, I can.
plus The Wonder of Cholesterol by Dr. Graveline. And then Dr. Seneff's only book that she's written, I wrote the foreword to, is Cindy and Erica's Dilemma.
Obsession.
Obsession, that's what it was.
Just
Obsession.
all America's
So
healthcare crisis. Yeah.
yeah, so it's a good book. It's been out for a while now, and you can pick that up on Amazon if you're interested in extremely intriguing autobiographical narrative of Dr. Seneff's journey into discovering and the enlightening information she did about the healthcare crisis. So,
Thank you.
all right. Well, thanks for all you do. It's really appreciated, and I'm looking forward to some even more great discoveries from you.
Thank you. Thanks for talking. It was great.